Hey, and welcome to the Making Websites Interactive module. I'm so excited about this one because you are going to learn JavaScript, and that is the language of web browsers. So it'll enable you to create interactive web apps. And JavaScript is actually used for a ton of other things as well, like creating servers, mobile apps, desktop applications, controlling robots, and SpaceX even uses JavaScript to send rockets into space. So what you're learning here is a true superpower. Throughout the module, you'll also learn a lot about the DOM, so-called Document Object Model. That's one of those fancy three-letter acronyms in programming that sound super scary, but actually aren't. This is just how you use JavaScript to control websites. And oh boy, you will do that a lot because you're going to build 4 apps in this module. Starting out very simple with a passenger counter before we move on to a game, namely Blackjack, one of the most popular casino games ever. Later on, you're also going to build an app that expresses yourself using emojis, and perhaps the coolest of them all, you're going to build a lead tracker application. This is a super useful tool for salespeople, and it's actually a full-blown Chrome extension. So you will deploy this to your Chrome browser so that you can try it out in the wild. So through that, you'll be able to experience yourself how an empty text editor is filled with code, then shipped into the world, and where it actually can create value for people, which is just so insanely awesome. And the teacher of this module will be yours truly. I'm going to teach the entire module, and I think we are going to have a ton of fun together. So with that, let's just get started building our very first interactive web app. Or actually, before we start, I'm going to ask you to do me a little favor, because I really want you to head over to the Today I Will channel on Discord and let the community know that you are starting Module 3 so that they can cheer for you and give you these emojis that encourage you to push through. So actually, this is not doing me a favor. You're first and foremost doing yourself a favor because this helps you stay accountable. So just click this image right here and you'll be taken to the channel. And after you've posted your message, I'll guide you through your first steps into the land of JavaScript. Your very first exposure to JavaScript will come through building a passenger counter app. Now you might ask yourself, why on earth should we build a passenger counter app? What's the point of that? Well, you'd be surprised. Because when I was 19, right around this time, my full-time job was to count people who entered the subway. So every day I would stand outside in the cold and be like, oh, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people entering the subway this morning. How interesting. And then I would bring up my pen and paper and note down the number 6, which at times was really cold. So it would have been so much better if I had a little people counter app on my Nokia phone so that I could just tap these buttons while having the phone in my pocket. But this was long before I learned to code. So instead, we are going to build this passenger counter app together so that you will learn the basics of JavaScript and so that you are prepared in case you, one time in the future, have to stand outside in the cold counting people who enter the subway. Welcome to this lesson where we are going to take a look at the setup for our people counter app. Here you can see we have a basic HTML structure, which probably looks familiar to you. You can see we have the HTML tag, the head tag, and inside of the body we only have 2 elements, the h1 and an h2. That is the title up here and our counter element. We also have some styling in our index.css. You can check it out here. This is just very basic styling that we're not going to go through because you want to get into the JavaScript as soon as possible. So the first thing we're going to do actually is to simply, inside of our body tag, create a so-called script tag, like that. Looks just like any other HTML tag. It just says script. And inside of here, we can actually write JavaScript. So inside of this tag, I'm going to write a pretty long JavaScript expression that you probably find a little bit frightening. But don't worry about that. You're not meant to really understand it in this lesson. I just want to demonstrate that this works. So I'm going to start by writing document. That refers to the HTML document itself. And then I'll do dot and get element by ID, and then open and close parentheses. And then inside of the parentheses, I'm going to copy the ID of our h2 element. So here we're saying, hey, HTML document, I want to get an element, and I want to get it by its ID. And the ID is this count L. So what do you think we get as a reply? Well, we grab a hold of this element right here. And then we can do dot inner text set that equal to, for example, 5. If I now run this code, you'll see that, boom, we have changed the text on the inside of the h2 element, this one right here, from 0 to 5 using JavaScript. And that opens up a whole world of opportunities. It essentially gives us the power to breathe life into our application and turn it into a real world product that solves problems for people. That's why this is so cool to learn. However, we are not going to write our JavaScript this way here. It's kind of an amateurish way to do it. What we rather want to do is create an index.js file. Like that. Here is our index.js file. It's currently empty. But what I'm going to do is copy this line here, and then paste it into the index.js file. And now I'll add an attribute to my script tag called src, which is short for source. And then inside of here, I'm just going to write index.js. We are in the HTML file and the JavaScript file is in the same folder, so I don't need to navigate into any folder or type in a complicated path here. Just write the name of the file. If we now run this code again, you can see that, yes, it still works. So now we have a proper setup for our app and we are ready to get started building our people counter. Let's move on. So today is actually a really important day in your life because you're going to write your first lines of JavaScript. And that is just such a powerful thing to do because you take the first step into a world of opportunities and it might even change your life. So in a year, you might want to celebrate this day as the anniversary, the day you met JavaScript and changed your life for the better. Anyway, the line you're going to write is not this long one right here. It's a little bit too difficult at the moment. I'm actually going to add a double slash in front of it. Like that, and you can see that grayed it out. That means that JavaScript will ignore this, since this is now a code comment, not real code. So if we run the code here in the browser, you can see that now we are not modifying the h2 tag anymore. So we are ready here down at line 3 to write our first lines of code. Now let's think a little bit. What do we need actually to build this subway passenger counter app? Well, the first thing we need is some way to store the count. And that's a natural job for JavaScript because it's kind of like the data we need to store. And when you need to store data, you need to create so-called variables to store the data in. And I'm now going to create a variable called count. And the way we do that is we write let count equal 0. So now we have a variable called count and it holds a tiny piece of data, namely the number 0. The way you can read this in English is actually let count be 0. So really natural. And let's actually try and verify that actually our count variable does indeed equal 0. Well, we can do that by using a tool that every single developer uses every single day. It's called console.log, and then open and close parentheses. And inside of these parentheses, you can put almost whatever you want. And in our case, we are going to put this count variable here. If we now run the code, you can see that down in the console at the bottom, we printed out the number 0. And the console is something that the browser provides us with. It's there mainly for debugging purposes, for checking our code like we are doing here, verifying that actually, I want to take a look at count. I want to print it out to the console and see with my own eyes that it is what I think it is. And indeed it was. And this console you see here is a Rimbus implementation of the console. If you want to check out the real-world console in the Chrome browser, you can, for example, head over to google.com or any page, basically, and then right-click and choose the Inspect option. When you click that, it'll open up this so-called Developer Tools, which shows you a bunch of HTML. As for now, we're not going to worry about that. Instead, just click on the Console option, and that'll open up a blank console where you actually, in addition to printing out stuff, which we did down here in the Scrimba console, you can write JavaScript as well. So if you want to write let count equals 5 and then hit enter, and then write console log and then pass in count in the parentheses, and then hit enter, you'll see that it'll log out 5 as well. So the console is available to you in all browsers and is a tool that developers use every single day. So I'm really happy that you've learned about it this early on. Now I actually have a challenge for you. I want you to do two things. First, you're going to create a variable called myAge and then set its value to your age. And then log the myAge variable to the console. So go ahead and do this right now, and then I will show you how to do it as well when you come back. Okay, hopefully that went well. Let's do it together. I'll do let myAge. I happen to be 35 at the moment. Then to console log out myAge, I'll do console.log, open and close parentheses, myAge. If we run this code, see, now we are printing out both the count and also myAge. So we have verified that our variables indeed work as expected. Before we move on, there's one thing I want to show you. And that is to take this line, console logging of myAge, and place it above the myAge variable declaration. So now we try to console log myAge before we define it, since JavaScript starts reading at the top and works its way downwards. So what do you think then will happen if I now remove these other console logs and only keep the myAge console log? Let's take a guess. Well, what happens is that we get a reference error. Cannot access myAge before initialization. So JavaScript actually understands what we're trying to do, that we're actually referencing a value before it has been initialized. And that simply doesn't work. So now that you are aware of that, let's move on. Okay, so let's return back to our count variable and learn some more advanced concepts, which is that you can actually use JavaScript kind of as a calculator. So instead of just writing let count equals 5, you can do let count equals 5 plus 7, for example. And when you run that code, you'll see 12 in the console. You can do minus, of course. That'll result in -2 in the console. Or you can even divide. That'll be 0.71, bunch of numbers after that. And of course, multiply gives us 35. So there's a lot of mathematical operations built into JavaScript, and you're not going to learn about all of them now. Because now, instead of just hard coding raw numbers, let's try to use variables here instead. Because oftentimes, you won't see this kind of operation. You'll normally see numbers represented as variables in real-world code bases. So removing this right here, for example, do let first batch equals 5. So this was the batch of people that first entered the subway wagon. And instead of hardcoding 5 here yet again, I'm just going to do count equals first batch. Well, what do you think will be logged out here then? Quite correctly, it's 5. Because first batch is 5, and count is set to the same as 5. And perhaps there was another batch as well. Let second batch, a group of people that entered just before the doors closed. Maybe that was 7 people. Well, then we can do count equals first batch plus second batch. Yes, this works as well. So this is a much more common thing to see in JavaScript, that a variable is set to the value of, for example, 2 other variables added together. Now, I want to comment out this like that. If you wonder how I did that magic of commenting out multiple lines at once, I did simply command plus K plus C, or replacing this with control if you're on a Windows machine. Because what I want to do now, I want to gather this code up here, and then I want to give you a 3-part challenge where you are going to convert your age into dog years. So first create 2 variables, myAge and human dog ratio. That is the ratio between human years and dog years. And for the sake of simplicity, we're going to say that 1 human year is about 7 dog years. Now, the calculation is actually a little bit more complicated than that, but that's not that important. And the important thing here is the learning. So set then the human dog ratio to 7, and then multiply the 2 variables together, and then store the result in my dog age. And finally, log my dog age to the console. This is great practice. It's important to build up your muscle memory. So go ahead and do this right now, and then return back to the screencast when you want to see how I solve it as well. Okay, hopefully that went well. Now let's do it together. Remove the console so we can get some more space here. And we'll start with my age, which still is 35. And we'll do human dog ratio. That should be 7. Finally, the my dog age should be my age multiplied with human dog ratio. Let's verify that this works by logging out my dog age. Running the code, and yes, we can see in the console we get 245. My god, I would be an old dog if I was a dog. I'm really glad I'm a human, actually. So let's move on. Okay, so let's return back to our count example. Now, you've learned how to initialize a variable and even how to do mathematical operations on it, both with hard-coded numbers and with other variables if we need that. And that's all great. However, up until now, we've just been working on the initialization or the so-called assignment of the variable. What if you want to reassign it, or in plain English, you want to change the variable? Well, then you can do that, for example, down here on line 5, and just do count equals 3. And if we now run the code, you can see that we log out 3 as opposed to 5, because JavaScript starts from the top and runs down and uses the latest value it can find for any variable defined with the let keyword. Now, there are other types of variables that you can't reassign like this, but we'll get to that later. As for now, we're just going to work with the let. And you can do this as many times as you want. If we want to change it even further down to 1, you can see now that JavaScript is only taking into account the line 7 reassignment of the count variable. So this is all good, but it doesn't really help us if we want to increment our people entered count with 1 every time we, for example, click a button. What we then want to do is something like count plus 1. Because we want to take the current count, keep track of how many we've counted up until now, and then just increment with 1. The way to do that is actually by simply doing like this. Now, this might look a little bit weird since we have count on both sides of the equal mark, and probably you've learned at school that the left and right hand side of the equal mark should be completely equal in mathematics. However, that's not how it works in JavaScript. Here we are assigning this variable to take on this value. So first you want to calculate the value, and the value is this point 5 plus 1. Well, then count now will be equal to 6. Let's run this code and see that it works. Yes. And let's say we wanted to increment it by 2. Then we do 2, and now it's 7 because 5 plus 2 is 7. Do the same thing again. This time we can increment it with 10. Now we're up at 17. And minus that with 2 again. And then we're down at 15. I think you get the point. Now I have a challenge for you. Okay, so you are to create a variable, bonus points. So this could, for example, be a game where your bonus points goes up and down. And I want you to initialize it as 50, and then increase it to 100, decrease it down to 25, and then finally increase it up to 70 again. And you are to use the same technique that we used here with the count, where you reassign the variable to the old value of the variable, and then adding or subtracting a value. And I want you to console log the value after each step. So go ahead and do this right now, and then I will show you the solution as well. Okay, hopefully this went well. Let's do this together. We'll start with let bonus points be 50. Console logging it out. And then we're going to do bonus points equals bonus points plus 50 because we want to get to 100. Again, console logging it. Next up, bonus points equals bonus points minus 75 because we want to get down to 25. Logging it out again. Finally, bonus points equals bonus points. Now we need to increase it with 45 to get to 70. Let's comment out this code up here and run the code, bring up the console, and yes, 50, 100, 25, 70. Great job. Let's move on. Okay, now you know enough JavaScript for us to move on to the HTML and build the interface for our app. And it's not a lot of interface. It's, to begin with, just a button. And later down the line, we're going to create another button. But it has to be written. And you are going to do that. So I want you to follow these instructions. You are to create an increment button. That is the text of the button. With the ID of increment-btn. So go ahead and do this right now. Okay. Hopefully that went well. Now let's do it together. Button. Then I'll create the closing tag. Inside of here, I'll write increment. Could have written count here, but I think increment is more of a technically descriptive word. So let's use that. And ID. increment-btn, like that. If we run this code, you will see, yes, we indeed have this button and it is already styled. How convenient. Let's check out the CSS for that. We have a general styling for buttons, which are reused across both of our buttons, since they're using the button selector. And then our increment button and our save button has a specific background, each of them. They're dark red and dark green. Great job doing this. Now the question is, how do we make this button interactive? Because right now, nothing happens if I click it. Well, in the next lecture, we'll go through exactly how to do that. Okay, so now we're going to put the different pieces in this puzzle together and also add a whole new piece. And in order to free up some space in our JavaScript file here, let's just remove this previous exercise and actually write out in pseudocode the procedures that we need to do in order to make this work. So first, we know that we need to store the count somewhere. And we know that we want to initialize it as 0. And then, as I said in the previous lesson, we need to kind of listen for clicks on this button here. When it's clicked, we need to increment our count. And then finally, which we aren't going to do just yet, but I just want to write that procedure out as well so that you know what to expect. We need to change the count_l, this paragraph right here, in the HTML to reflect the new count. So we know how to initialize the count as 0, and we know how to increment a count variable. So to achieve these first three, we need to do this task, that is listening for clicks on the increment button. And that can be done in a multitude of ways. The easiest one is simply in the HTML defining an onClick event listener. You simply write onClick equals and then something in between quotes. So this is an attribute in the HTML, just like the ID is an attribute as well. And inside of here, you write the function that you want to be triggered when the button is clicked. So I'm going to write increment and open and close parentheses here. Now, that probably looks really weird for you. And that's totally okay if you're confused by what's going on here, because we've seen nothing of the word increment in our JavaScript yet. So rightfully so, we need to create that function. I'll do that down here, and I'll use the keyword function, then the name, increment, open and close parentheses, and then open and closed square brackets. So pretty funky syntax right there. And the first time you type them, it feels weird, but over time it becomes second nature. What you write inside of these curly brackets is the so-called body of the function. And that piece of code that is in the body will be executed every time this function is called or invoked. That's the same thing. So just to see it in action, I'm going to write console log button was clicked. Like that. So if we run the code and I click the button, you can see that in the console we see the button was clicked. If I do it again and again, so every single time the button is clicked, this piece of code runs. And it runs because we in the HTMLs are saying, hey JavaScript, when this button is clicked on the onClick event, then I want you to run a function called increment. And that's what's happening here. And then JavaScript is like, yeah, for sure. It sits ready and listens for that specific click event. And JavaScript can do that. It pays attention to what the user does on the screen. And when it sees someone clicking on this button, it fires off this piece of code. This was probably a lot of information to parse in one go. So before we move on and continue on turning our pseudocode into real JavaScript, let's take a closer look at functions over the next few casts so that you get to write some functions as well and build up your understanding and muscle memory. Okay, so let's pretend that we are building a race car game. So here I have some comments which are meant as pseudocode for the functionalities of the game. And the only real functional part of it is these 5 console logs, which are counting down from 5 to 1. So we start the game by setting up the race, and then we do 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If I run the code, you can see that is logged to the console. That means that it's go, players are to start racing, and they would be running the race, and then the race is finished, and a winner is declared. And then, of course, we are getting ready for a new race. However, with the current knowledge we have about JavaScript, the way we would count down for a new race would have to be to copy all of these lines and paste them in down here. so that now when we run it, we get 54321 printed 2 times to the console. However, this isn't good. Anytime you see this kinds of repetitions in your code, you should try to think, is there any way we can extract this into a function? And that is exactly what we are going to do. We are going to refactor this so that it instead uses a function. Another word for function could be command. So we are asking JavaScript to kind of remember a command so that we can use it later on as well. And that command can be as comprehensive as you want. In our case, it's going to be to count down from 5 to 1. So let's just do this to see it in action. To create a function, as I talked about in the previous cast, we use the function keyword. And then the name of the function, I'm going to call this function countdown. And then open and close parentheses. And then open and close curly brackets. And all of the action happens inside of the curly brackets. So I'm going to break that into a new line. And I'm going to copy all of these console logs and then paste them inside here, like that. And here I'm tabbing it out just to highlight that this code is inside of that function. And this is not something JavaScript cares about. It's to make our code easy to read for humans. So now I have declared our function. However, if we remove this down here and now try to run the code, nothing happens because it has only been declared. It hasn't been what we called invoked or also called, as this code inside of here will only run if we call the function. So if JavaScript was a dog and we've taught our dog to roll around, then in order to get our dog to actually roll around, we have to say roll around. Same thing here. We have taught JavaScript to count down, but in order for it to actually do the counting, we have to say countdown. And we do that like this. Simply writing countdown with open and close parentheses. So now you can see when I run the code, it indeed does the counting, but if I comment this out, it does nothing. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this countdown and I'm going to put it all the way here at the top. And then I'm going to call it when we are ready to start the first race. And then also call it when we are ready to start the second race. Now, if I run the code, you can see that we indeed count down 2 times before the first race and before the second race. And this is much better than typing out all 5 console logs, both here on line 11 and on line 19. So we have compressed our code a lot. So with this knowledge fresh in mind, let's move on to the next cast where you are to write your first function. Okay, now it's your turn. You are going to create a function that logs out the number 42 to the console. And you can decide the name of the function. And when you've done that, make sure you call or invoke the function as well. So go ahead and do this right now. Okay, let's do this. I'm going to call it my logger, open and close brackets, and then inside of the body do console.log 42. Now we need to call it my logger, like that. We run the code, and yes, you can see we are logging 42 to the console. Great job. Okay, time for a new challenge. So in our race car game, we have certain laps, and of course we track how much time our players use to race through the laps. And here we have 3 lap times in the variable lap 1, lap 2, and lap 3. And the thing is, if you create a function down here on line 6, it will be able to access these 3 variables from within the function. So what I want you to do now is create a function that simply logs out the sum of all the 3 laps. So that'll be the total racing time for a player. So you decide what name you want to give it. Just write that function that logs out the total lap time and then run the function as well. Okay, hopefully that went well. Let's do this. The function, I'm going to call this function log lap time, open and close parentheses. And here I can either first create a variable, let total time, for example, and do lap 1 plus lap 2 plus lap 3, and then console log out total lap time, like that, and then log lap time, invoke the function down here on line 11. If we now run the code, you can see, yes, we are logging out 103. This is one way of doing it. Alternatively, I could have skipped creating this variable in here and simply added the variables inside of the console log. It will give me, as you can see, the exact same result. Now, the reason I wanted to create this variable here, though, is to just show you one thing, which is that while this function could access these variables from the so-called global scope, the outer scope, which is not on the inside of the function, but on the outside of it, this doesn't work the other way around. So if I now just try to console log total time from the outer scope, if we run this, you can say total time is not defined. That is because when you define a let variable inside of this scope, it only exists inside of this block of code. This is the scope in which the function lives. And that's why we call let variables block scoped. So that might be a little bit confusing, in that the lap could go from the outside of the function and to the inside of the function, but total time couldn't go from the inside of the function to the outside of the function. But don't worry too much about this. JavaScript will tell you when something isn't defined, and you can be sure that you will misstep at times, but that's just a part of the process. Let's now move on to the next challenge. Okay, so now you have to combine some of the things you've learned up until now in order to build this lap counter feature. Because in our racing game, we want to keep track of how many laps a player has completed, so I've created this variable called laps completed and initialized it to 0. So what I want you to do now is create a function that increments the laps completed variable with 1 every time you run the function. And then I want you to run or call or invoke or whatever you want to call it, this function 3 times. So that on line 9 here, the value that's logged out will be 3. Now, if you're wondering how to increment a variable in JavaScript, just look back a few casts because we did that previously. So now you have to combine that knowledge with your freshly acquired knowledge about writing functions. So go ahead and give this your best try right now. Okay, hopefully that went well. If not, no worries, let's do this together so that you get to see how we do it. Do function, and I'm going to call this function increment lap, like that, open and close parentheses, and then open and close curly brackets. And here, we have to increment this variable just as we did a few casts ago by doing laps completed equals the old value of laps completed plus 1, like that. I now run increment lap 1 time. You'll see that we're logging out 1. Good stuff. Let's invoke it 3 times. And there we can see we are logging out 3 to the console. So, great job doing this. If you didn't manage it, just go back and try again now that you've seen my solution. Because it's really important that you actually write the code here so that you build up that important muscle memory. Okay, we're back at the Subway Counter app. And as you can see, I've deleted the increment function because I want you to write it instead. It's much better than me writing everything. And you have to do it as a part of turning these first 3 lines of pseudocode into real code. So you're going to initialize the count as 0. You're going to listen for clicks on the increment button. And thus you have to create that function that's triggered when the increment button is clicked. And then you are going to increment the count. I'm going to add a final little challenge here, and that is to log it out after the count variable has been incremented. So go ahead and do this right now, and then afterwards I'll of course show you the solution as well. Okay, hopefully that went well. Let's do this together. We'll do function, increment, open and close parentheses, open and close curly brackets. We have the button. Let's verify that it works. A good thing to do after every single step so that you know if you at some point get a bug, you will have a better understanding of where it happens since you know which steps you were able to get to without triggering any bugs. So I'll do clicked, run the code, click the button, yes, that works. Okay, now we need to increment the count. So we're going to do that inside here, and of course then we need the count initialized to begin with. So count equals 0 here. As you remember, it's just as we're simply going to do what we did up at line 4. We'll do count equals count plus 1. Now finally, console log count. I'm going to remove this and run the code, hit increment, Yes, we see 1, and 2, and 3, and 4. Nice. So then we have done these 3 parts. And remove this helper code right here. We have the final part left. And we can finally start understanding what this weird piece of code here up on line 1 that we worked with in the very beginning of the course actually means. Let's do that in the next lecture. Okay, so we are ready to add the final piece of the puzzle, which is to change the count L. That is the h2 right here, which currently has 0. So that reflects the new count. And the new count is down here, which we are logging out. So we have to do something down here at line 9. And what we're going to do is take this line right here, which has just been lying here in the background all along. Now, in order to properly understand this expression, I think we should break it into 2. Take the first part, where we're actually asking for the HTML element, and the second part, where we're actually modifying the HTML element. So starting with the first part, I'm going to store this in a variable called countL, like that, and do document get element by ID, open and close parentheses, and passing in countL, this exact string right here. Notice that we're using a different naming convention here in the JavaScript. This is called camel case, like that, where you capitalize the first letter of the second word, but not the first letter of the first word. This is how you want to write JavaScript variables. It's a very normal convention. And also, if we were to try to use the same convention as we've been using in our HTML and CSS, JavaScript would actually tell us, you can't do that. As you can see, we are getting a red line under this character, which is JavaScript's way of complaining to us, because it's not a valid variable name when you use dash. So we got to remove it, like that. Now, as always, what do you think we should do now that we've taken one step into the unknown? Well, of course, we're going to use our good old friend console log, because we have to verify at every single step that we're actually on track, if we haven't introduced any bugs. So I'll do console.log and logging out countL. And if we bring up the console, we can see actually we're getting what looks like an HTML element in the console. That's pretty interesting. Now, it's actually not a real HTML element. It's more of a representation. It's a model of an HTML element. And it gives us a lot of other opportunities to change it using JavaScript as well. But for now, it's perfectly fine to think of this as just, that is the element that we are seeing right here. It's JavaScript's representation of that element. Because remember, we said, hey, HTML document, why don't you get me the element that has the ID of countL? And the HTML was like, yeah, sure, just take it. And then you store that in the countL variable. And now you as a JavaScript developer have control over this element and you can manipulate it, which is exactly what we're going to do down here at line 14. Because now we're going to move on to the second part of this big expression, which is modifying the element itself. .innertext equals 5, or in our case, how would we write this? Well, we've turned this big thing here into this variable. So we'll use this variable and do .innertext. That is innertext like that, equals. And we're not going to set it to 5 because that wouldn't make any sense. What are we going to set it to? Think a second about that. Indeed, it is the count, because we know from console logging earlier on that the count does indeed increment correctly. And now we're just saying that we want the inner text, that is the text on the inside of the tags, we want it to be the count. We'll run the code, hit the increment button, and yes, it works. Now we are incrementing, we are counting people. Really good job reaching this point. Your JavaScript skills are starting to become dangerous, as you now know how to create interactive apps. Now, before we move on, there's one thing I want to mention, which is that this get element by ID here and this .log, both are functions in the same way our increment function is a function. Now, they are hooked onto the document object and the console object, but that's just a nuance. They're still functions, or methods as we call functions that are hooked onto so-called objects. If that sounds confusing, it's because it should be at this point, because you haven't learned about objects yet and methods on objects. But don't worry about that. Just think of them as functions. And actually, the thing we've been doing here of adding something in between the parentheses of the function when we are calling it is called to pass in arguments, which means that we are giving the function some data to work with. Like here, we're specifying the ID of the element we want to grab. Otherwise, if we didn't do that, this function would just be running in the wild and not know what to look for. Likewise, in this .log here, we're passing in which variable we want to log to the console. If we didn't do this, the log function wouldn't know what to log. So speaking in analogies, if the function is a chef that are to cook a meal for you, then the arguments you pass in are the ingredients the chef uses to cook that meal. So hopefully that made everything a bit more clear. Let's clean up this code and move on. Now, before we move on, I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing here, where we're saying document.getElementById. Because you'll often hear developers refer to this technique as working with the DOM. And that's one of those 3-letter acronyms in web development that sounds super complicated. And I was really confused about this when I was learning to code. And I want you to avoid that confusion. So let's just unpack this expression. It's short for document object model. That sounds really fancy. However, it's actually just how you use JavaScript to modify a website. It's just that the people naming this wanted to give it a really abstract name. But if we look at each of the words separately, the name actually does make sense. So let's do that, starting with a document. Why that? Well, that's because what you are interacting with is an HTML document. Object? Well, that's because the document keyword in JavaScript is of the data type object, meaning they've taken the HTML document and shoved it into a JavaScript object. Of course, that's a little bit of a simplification, but that's the essence. So this word document is of the data type object. Now, you haven't learned about objects yet, though you're going to do that a little bit later. Finally, there's model. Model is basically a representation or a modelation. Kind of like, there's the real Saturn V rocket that NASA built, and then there's the Lego model. And that's how it is here as well. There's the real HTML element, which you've written in your .html file. And then there's the JavaScript model, the representation you have of this element in JavaScript. So, don't be frightened when people talk about the DOM. Just in your head, translate it to how to use JavaScript to modify websites. And with that out of the way, let's move on with the coding. Or actually, before we move on, I have to admit that I fooled you a little bit. Because the problem with the previous lecture was that I wrote the code, and that's just wrong. You are going to write the code. That's how you learn. So, I have removed the 2 lines of code that I wrote, namely grabbing the COUNTL element and storing it in a COUNTL variable, and also setting the COUNTL's inner text to the COUNTL. So just do that, and if you struggle, just go back and look at my solution. There's no need for me to type this out for you yet again. Just go ahead and give it your best shot and refer to that if you need help, and I will see you in the next lecture. Okay, it's time for you to build some muscle memory, because you are going to create a save button and a save function. You're going to start with a function. Here is the instructions. Create a function called save, which logs out the count when it's called. We're going to modify this to do some other stuff afterwards, but as for now, I want to just log out the count. Secondly, in the HTML, you are going to create the save button. You are to set the ID as saveBTN and have it call the save function when it is clicked. So, go ahead and do this right now and then return back to the screencast when you want to see my solution. Okay, hopefully that went well. Let's do this. We'll do function, save, open and close parentheses, and then the body of the function will console log the count. If we want to check that this actually works now, we can call the save function, run the code, and we can see, yes, that the count is indeed logged out as a consequence of us calling the function here on line 15. Okay, let's remove that. Going over to the HTML, we're going to create the save button, and we do open button tag. Then I'll just close it right away. I'll write save in between the tags and give it the ID of save.btn. Now we can actually run it to see that it renders. Yes, it indeed does. But nothing happens when we click it, and that's because we have to do on click. We want to run the save function. Here we have to invoke it with the open and close parentheses. Otherwise, it won't call the function. So rerunning the code, hitting save. Yes, there we are logging out 0. because of this line. Now we can increment a couple of times and see, ooh, now we're logging out 6. Pretty nice. Now we're starting to get somewhere. It's only a matter of saving the count to the website as well and rendering it out under the buttons. But before that, there's some new concepts you need to learn, so I'll see you in the next cast. Okay, so now it's time for us to build this little functionality here, which allows us to save the number of people who have entered into the subway at each of the departures. However, this requires you to work with this full paragraph, which actually includes both numbers, which you can see, but also like regular text, previous entries, and some symbols as well. And once you move away from just straight out numbers in JavaScript, you're moving into the land of so-called strings. And strings is a data type in JavaScript. And in case you wondered, yes, numbers is also a data type. And if you think the word string is a little bit weird, well, you can also think of this as just text. The strings you work with in JavaScript are normally meant to be text that the user reads on the page. Now, we have been working with text here before. We've hard-coded in some text here and there in the HTML. And actually, as far as HTML knows, everything is strings. It doesn't even know about numbers. HTML can't do calculations for you. So when I'm talking about strings and numbers, I'm talking about it in the context of JavaScript. And even though you're probably not even aware of it, you've actually written a string already up here on line 1. You've wrapped the count-l inside of 2 quotes. And that is how you create a string in JavaScript. But you've had far from enough practice to start working with strings in our people counter app. So in the next lesson, we're going to go over the basics of it. And then you're going to solve some challenges so that we build up that muscle memory and make you capable of using strings in our app. So I'll see you there. So strings are used all over the place in software. Let's say that you, for example, are building an app where people can authenticate. Well, then most likely you have to store some kind of username for your users. And that would most likely be stored as a string. For example, pair, wrapped in double quotes. Then this string, just like we did with numbers, will be stored in a variable. So let username equals pair. Now we can console log out username, and we get pair logged to the console. Now, one thing I want to mention is that I'm using double quotes here to create this string. I could use single quotes instead if I want to. You can see that works. However, I cannot start with a single quote and end with a double quote. As you can see, now our editor tells us that this syntax is off. And if we try to run the code, we are getting a syntax error. So you got to stick with one or the other. And I usually use double quotes, but that's just a matter of preference. If you prefer single quotes, go ahead. Now I want to give you a challenge. Right here, you are to create a variable message that stores the string. You have 3 new notifications. Go ahead and do that right now. Okay, hopefully that went well. Let's do this. Message equals this string right here. Now, what we want to do here is combine this string with this string, because this string right here is probably the result of us checking in the database and seeing that, oh, there's 3 new notifications that pair hasn't seen. So render out this string right here. And then, of course, we need to combine it with the name. So what we want to do is message plus username, like that. When we add a plus here, we so-called concatenate the 2 strings together. So let's have a look at what happens when we run the code. It becomes a slightly ugly string. We have 3 new notifications pair with no space in between the strings, so it kind of becomes like this. This isn't really what we wanted. What we then also can do is add a 3rd string in between here, which includes a comma and a space. Now, if we run it, you have 3 new notifications pair. And maybe we even want to add a exclamation mark at the end, like that. As you can see, when we use the plus for strings, it simply concatenates the characters together. Okay, now I have a new challenge for you. You are to create a variable message to user that contains the message we have logged. By that, I mean the entire message in here. This should be a new variable. And then afterwards, I would log it out just to make sure that you have configured the message to user in the correct way. Go ahead and do this right now. Okay, to do this, you do let message to user equals message plus comma space plus username plus exclamation mark. Now we can replace all of this with message to user. And running the code again, we get the exact same string, which is just what we wanted. Great job. Okay, time for another challenge. You are to create two variables, name and greeting. And the name variable should store your name, and the greeting should store, for example, hi, my name is. Then you are to create a third variable, my greeting, that concatenates the two strings, and finally log the my greeting variable to the console. So this is just to give you some muscle memory. Go ahead and do this right now. Okay, let's do this. I'll do let name equals Per Harold Morgan, then let greeting, hi, my name is, and then a space at the end. And then finally, let my greeting equals greeting plus name. Then to see how this went, we do console log my greeting. Running the code, yes, we get hi, my name is Per Harold Morgan. Now, notice that here, I added the space inside of one of the strings as opposed to doing something like that. However, doing that would work the exact same way. So, great job solving this challenge. Let's move on.
You to the log.
Okay, now let's mix it up a little bit. Let's say that my name isn't Per Harold Morgan, it's actually 42. A strange name, but anyway, what do you think will happen when we have one number and one string? What will the result be? Let's do it. It's actually, hi, my name is 42. So the 42 here has actually been turned into a string that has been added into like this. And that's kind of what happens. In a wrestling game between a string and a number, the string always wins. Now, this was a little bit of a weird example, so let's take one that's a bit more interesting. Let's try let points equals 4, and then let's say bonus points. This is some kind of game. That is 10. Let total points equals points plus bonus points, total points. Now, what do you think we'll log out here? I'm going to comment out this one right here. Take 2 seconds to think about what the result will be. Okay, let's run this. The result is 410. That is weird, because perhaps you expected 14? No, as I said, the string always wins. So when we say 4 plus 10, which is the values of these variables, the 4 will be turned into a string, and the result when you concatenate two strings is just very easy to see by just removing this fluff in between them, 410. If the numbers won the wrestling game, it would be like this, and it would indeed log out 14. But it didn't. So I'm going to give you a couple of challenges here. What do you think these 4 console logs will log out? Take a minute to think about that. Potentially write your solutions in a code comment, either above or perhaps even after each of the lines, and then return back to the screencast, and then we'll have a look at it together. Okay, here we have a number and a number, so this will end up as a number as well. 4 plus 5 is 9, as far as I can remember. Here, a string plus a string, even though they are number characters inside of the strings, that doesn't matter. JavaScript still sees this as a string, and the result will be a string of 24. Here, a wrestling match between a string and a number. Sadly, the number always loses, so this will be 51. And finally, again, wrestling match between a number and a string. The result is always that the string wins, so this will be 100, 100, like that. Let's run the code. Yes! As you also can see from the console, the way the Scrimba console highlights the difference between numbers and strings is with the color. The strings are white, whereas the numbers are blue. So, great job, let's move on. Okay, it's time for a challenge. This time, you are going to create a feature that we already have on Scrimba. Because on the dashboard, we welcome our users by saying, "Welcome back, Per Harold Morgan." That's a normal thing a lot of apps do, so it makes sense to try to implement it. And the way you want to do it is through grabbing a hold of this paragraph here, which I've given an ID of welcome-l. That is the first part of the challenge. You're going to store that paragraph in a variable called welcome-l using this camel case convention. And then you are to create two variables, name and greeting, that contains your name and the greeting we want to render on the page. In our case, that is welcome back. Finally, you are going to render the entire welcome message using welcome-l.innertext. So go ahead and give this one a shot, and then I will show you the solution when you return back to this cast. Okay, let's do this. We'll start by grabbing the welcome-l paragraph. Do let welcome-l equals document.getElement by ID, passing in the ID we have here, like that. Now we need to create the two variables. Let name, my name is Per Harold Borgen. Let greeting, I'll do welcome back. And finally, rendering it out. That is done by doing welcome-l.innertext equals greeting plus name. Now, if we run this, we can see we are rendering out welcome back Per Harold Borgen, but there's no space between welcome back and my name. That can easily be solved by just adding a space after welcome back. Or we could, of course, hard-code it in between these two variables when we concatenated the string as well, but that doesn't really matter that much in this case. So let's just stick with this and move on to the next lesson. Okay. Now, there's one more thing you want to do, because personally I think this welcome message could be a little bit more lively and fun, and what would help there is to add an emoji. For example, this emoji right here. That will look pretty nice. So I want you to add that to the welcome element inner text. However, there's a catch. You are not allowed to modify the code over line 9. You have to write it below. So the question is, how can you add this emoji to the end here in the browser by simply writing more code, not by modifying any of the existing code? And to give you a hint, you need to remember back what you did when you incremented numbers, this technique here. You can do the same thing with welcome-l.innertext. So go ahead and give this a shot. Okay, hopefully that went well. If not, no worries, we'll do this together. What we're simply going to do here is, instead of using count, we're going to use welcome-l.innertext. And instead of the 1, we're going to use an emoji. So here we'll do welcome-l.innertext equals the old welcome-else innertext plus this new emoji right here. And an emoji is just a string like all other characters. It's just rendered out a little bit fancy. So if we run this, you can see, yes, we indeed get the emoji at the end. Now, before we leave, I want to teach you a little trick, because this line here is pretty clunky, writing the welcome-l.innertext twice. It's not something you'll see out in the wild, because there's a shorter version of writing this, and that is simply using the plus equal operator. What it does, it takes the current value you have and then adds this one after it. So it's the exact same thing that you were doing here. It seems a bit weird to do this plus equal sign here. Just try and remember that it simply takes what you have here and adds this to it. So that after this line, welcome.innertext consists of the entire thing here. Okay, with that in mind, let's go back to our passenger counter app. Okay, just a minor thing before we start using strings in our app. I want you to use the plus equals technique instead of this slightly longer count equals count plus 1 technique. So go ahead and do that. Okay, hopefully that went well by simply doing like this. Count plus equals 1. Run the code. Yes, it works. Let's move on. Okay, so now you are going to solve a super cool challenge. You're going to take everything you've learned about JavaScript up until now and use it to create this save feature. You can see it says previous entries and then 4, 5, 11 with dashes that separate them. And these are of course added every time you hit the save button. Now, there's a dash after the 3 numbers as well. Don't worry about that. It might look a little bit weird, but it's the easiest way to do this. And we want to do it the easiest way now that you're building stuff like this first time around. We don't want to worry about details. Make it work first, then make it better. That's my philosophy. So we're just going to make this work. Okay, so your 3 challenges are listed as comments here in the JavaScript. And in the HTML, I'm going to write the paragraph for you so that you have something to work with. So this is a p tag, and it should say previous entries like that, and I'm going to give it an ID equals save-l for save element. Then you are going to grab the save element paragraph and store it in a variable called save-l. And then in the save function, which is triggered when the save button is clicked on, you are going to create a variable that contains both the count, that is the number, and the dash separator. So it'll look something like this, like 12 space dash space. And then you are to render this newly created variable into the save element using innertext. However, you must make sure that you don't delete the existing content from the save-l paragraph, because you want to concatenate the string, not wipe it out entirely and replace the paragraph with the latest entry. So you got to remember your plus equal. But luckily, you know how to use plus equals, and that might be helpful in this situation. Finally, one thing I want to mention is that you might struggle a little bit with the spaces here, and it might end up slightly different than what you can see here. And that is perfectly okay, don't worry about that. In the next cast, actually, we are going to do some searching online to figure out if there's some alternative methods we can do this on, which will help us keep these spaces. That's a critical part of web development, searching for solutions online. So I've left a little gotcha for you here so that we get a nice little problem to solve using Google and some online docs in the next cast. So don't worry about that. Just go ahead and give this your best shot. And if you need help, just revert to this screencast and I will show you the solution as well. Okay, hopefully this went well. If not, no worries. Let's do it together. First, we are going to do let save-l. That'll be document.getElementById, and we are going to get the save-l like that. As always, I like to console log just to see that I have the correct element fetched. Let's run this code, and yes, bringing up the console, we see that we have grabbed the correct element. Then we can move on. First, create a variable that contains both the count and the dash separator. So what are we going to call this variable? I intentionally didn't give you a name for it because I want you to think what could be a suitable name for this string. And there's no right or wrong answer, but one thing you could call it would be count string or count str, like that. So it is the count, but we've turned it into a string, so a count string kind of makes sense. And the value of it will be count plus, and then the string. I'll add a space, a dash, and a space. All right. 3, render the variable using innertext. Okay, let's do it down here. We'll do save-l dot innertext, and then you might have been tempted to do equal count, but that won't work. Let's just try it. Run the code, we increment, and we hit save. Boom, then we suddenly remove the previous entries text. We cleared it out, of course, because we set all of the inner text to be just this count string. That doesn't work. We have to take into account what was there previously as well. So we add plus equals like that. Increment, 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 save. Yes, that works. All right, so it works really well actually. However, this dash at the end here is gone, as is our space here in the paragraph. And that is a bit weird because we want to keep those spaces. However, it's also a great opportunity to do some searching online in order to solve this problem, which is a critical skill for any developers, namely finding answers online. So we'll do that in the next cast. Okay, so we have this little problem here, which is that our spaces aren't working in the way we want them to work. Basically, this space here gets lost on the way somewhere. I don't know where, but it happens. How do we go about figuring out what's wrong? Well, looking at these 2 lines, which is where we deal with this save element paragraph, you can think what would be a suspect? Which tool that we're using would be a good suspect? And I'm going to point to this one right here, because I happen to know that that is actually the guilty one, the inner text. And let's say you would guess that as well. How do you go about finding another tool that doesn't work this way? Well, one thing you can do is you can write innertext alternative and then MDN. Put that into Google and see what it returns. And MDN is short for Mozilla Developer Networks, and it's a great resource. So if we do that, type that into Google, you can see the very first result is node text content. Okay, that's interesting. Let's click into that. There we land on an interface you're going to get very familiar with, the MDN web docs. And it says node.textcontent. Don't worry about this node here. It's kind of a fancy way of saying HTML element. Sort of, not entirely, but just translate it to HTML element right now, and you'll be good. And then you can read the text content property of the HTML element represents the text content of the element. Okay, seems pretty useful to me. And then we can scroll a little bit down. And then you see they've actually listed up differences between inner text and text content. And here, if we scan through this, you can see that inner text only shows human readable elements. And yet again, inner text is aware of styling and won't return the text of hidden elements. Okay, so it seems to be that the inner text somehow struggles a little bit to return things that are hidden or not human readable. And space is certainly not that human readable as a character. So maybe we can just change it then to .text content instead. Let's try that. Text content, code, increment, save. Oh, yes, indeed. Now we get the spaces. And one thing I want to highlight here is that while the Mozilla Web Docs is a great resource, it's very comprehensive, the language you'll see in these kinds of documentation sites is often very technical. That's why I kind of skimmed through and found some hints of human readable and hidden, and I kind of didn't worry too much about going into depth. And I think you as well should think, when you see a page like this, don't feel that you need to understand everything. And for the love of God, don't try to learn the code by just reading documentation. Some people say that's a good idea. I think it's a terrible idea. You want to slowly learn how to get comfortable reading documentation, but you also want to ignore all of the complex stuff that it's very often wrapped within. And there are other sites as well that explain things in various degrees of difficulty. For example, there's also something called W3 Schools, which is very good. There's Stack Overflow and many more, and you're going to see more of this as you progress in the course, as we're going to come back to this debugging concept later on as well. But as for now, we've just had a little sneak peek on the Mozilla Developer Network. And actually, it's kind of trash-talking the .innertext here and saying that it's also computationally expensive. So to me, I've gotten enough hints that I actually want to use .text content instead of inner text. I'm going to change this up here as well. Like that. It still works. Great. Now our app is almost complete. There's only one more thing we need to do, and we'll do that in the next cast. Okay, so now we are going to put the final pieces in our puzzle. Because we need to fix the fact that if I increment this and then hit save, and then the subway leaves the station and I'm going to count a new group of people, then with the current solution, I will be counting further on from 6, like 7, 8, 9, and that's not what we want. We want this one to be set back to 0 every time we hit save. And to do this, you need to write 2 lines of code. And at this point, I want to just throw you into the deep end of the pool and see how you swim. So I'm not going to give you any hints or write any pseudocode or tell you where you're going to write these 2 lines. Now you really have to think and think for yourself, what do you need to do here in order to make this work? And feel free to hack a little bit on it, try a solution, run the code, see how it works, console log out the values, and just hack away at it and give it your best shot. And if you don't manage to do it, no worries at all, because I will show you how to do it again, of course, when you return back to the screencast. So then you can just try to do it again after you've seen my solution. Anyway, enough talk, jump into the code here and give this a shot. Okay, now let's solve this together. So, what we need to do is write a couple of lines in this save function, because this is where the magic should happen, because it's when we hit the save button that we want this value to be set back to 0. And how do we set this element to be 0? Well, it is the count element, which we've worked with previously. And setting it to 0, we know how to do that. We can do count L dot text content and set that equal to 0, like that. If I rerun the code, increment, hit save, and yes, it's now 0. But if I now try to hit the increment again, you'll see, oh, 5. That's weird. Why is that? Well, that's because we have indeed set the text content of the count element to 0. So this h2 right here. But in the JavaScript, we're still keeping track of the count, and that count has been incremented at this point 5 times. So what we needed to do here, when we set the text content to 0, is to also set the count back to 0 as well. Because JavaScript remembers what we've done previously, unless we refresh the entire browser. So even though JavaScript can see that, yeah, you are setting the text content of this element here to 0, it still keeps track of the count here, and JavaScript can't deduct that. Since you want to set this here to 0, you also want this to 0. No, you gotta give JavaScript very specific instructions. So you need to do here, count equals 0 as well. Now if we run the code, bam, 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 save, it's set to 0, and yes, we indeed start at 0 again. So, great job reaching this far. So, you have built your very first JavaScript app from scratch. Congratulations. That is a huge accomplishment. So give yourself a pat on the back. You have really learned a lot in this section. And to prove that to you, we're actually going to do a little recap so that you get to see in front of you all of the new concepts you've shoved into your brain at this point. So we started out with the script tag. If you remember, we had it here in the index.html file, and we wrote our JavaScript internally in this file. However, we realized that that wasn't the way we wanted to go, so we instead pointed this script tag to a source, namely the index.js file, so that we could write our JavaScript there instead. Then we moved on quickly and learned about variables, namely the let variable, and we set its value to a number, which brings us to your very first data type, numbers. You learned how to work with numbers, do mathematical operations, and even increment numbers here on line 6, and also reassign the count variable to 0 here on line 14. So a lot of work with numbers in this app. But you also learned about strings, which was your second data type. Here you added a string to build the save feature, and also you console logged out a few strings along the way with code that we've deleted now, so I added this console log here to remind you about it. Because that is a truly important concept in developing, and you will use it throughout your entire career. Also, another thing you will use constantly as a developer is functions. You learned how to create functions like this increment and save function, and also how to call them, aka invoke them, from the HTML file here on the button clicks. And that brings us to the next concept which you learned a ton about, which is the DOM, or the Document Object Model, or what I like to call it, how to use JavaScript to change the website. So we interacted with the DOM at several places, for example up here where we did document.getElementById. That's one you are going to get very familiar with throughout this module. We passed in the ID as a string, so that the JavaScript was able to head into the HTML and fetch out the content you told it to look for. And another way we interacted with the DOM was through the innertext property. We used that here instead of text content, but then we Googled our way to the Mozilla Developer Network and realized that actually text content is a better solution. So we learned about that, and oh my god, this is a lot of concepts to learn. I can totally understand if you're a little bit overwhelmed, and if you feel that you are on thin ice on a few of these concepts, that's totally okay. We are going to repeat all of these things over and over again throughout the module, so don't worry about that. Actually, we are going to jump directly into a section where you are going to get assignments that test you for these skills, just to give you that repetition and muscle memory you need in order to make these concepts become second nature. So let's go ahead and get some repetition. And then once we've done with that, we'll move on to our next big project, the Blackjack app, which is going to be so much fun to build. So I can't wait to see you there. But for now, let's jump into a few quick fire challenges. Or actually, before we move on with the challenges, I want you to share your win in the community. And of course, I'm talking about the Today I Did channel. So click this image and then tell the community that you've built your first JavaScript app, completed the passenger counter section, and will be there to cheer for you. Once you've done that, you can move on with the JavaScript challenges in the next section.